In the waning days of the summer of 1797, when the air over Portugal's southern coast hung heavy with the scent of ripening grapes and the distant hum of cicadas, the people of Villamoura found themselves speaking of only one thing: the upcoming gathering at the Duarte Estate, a name that had lingered in their collective memory for generations, not merely for its wealth or its influence, but for the strange, almost whispered legends that clung to it like the ivy to its ancient walls. Luis Duarte, the estate's current master, had sent out invitations not by the clumsy hands of messengers or the public posting at the market square, but by a far older, more personal method: handwritten letters, each sealed in dark crimson wax pressed with the Duarte crest, the ink within so black it seemed to glisten with its own strange sheen under candlelight, as though the words themselves had been dipped not merely in pigment, but in something richer, heavier. Recipients included the wealthiest merchants of Lisbon, minor royals who had been content to wither away in coastal villas, aging scholars whose eyes still glittered with curiosity, and a scattering of foreign dignitaries who had been in Portugal long enough to know that an invitation from Luis Duarte was never something one simply declined. The letter, written in Luis's elegant but strangely angular script, promised a celebration of a century-old family tradition, and spoke with reverent authority of unveiling the first pressing of the Duarte crimson wine, a blend supposedly perfected over generations since the reign of King Muon III, a wine that, according to family legend, had never before been offered beyond the estate walls. Yet there was something else in the wording, something intangible but persistent, that seemed to beckon those who read it, as if the paper itself carried a faint vibration, a whisper just beneath the wreaths. Yet as the night deepened and the candles burned lower, a heaviness began to settle over the table, not the simple languor of full bellies and warm drink, but something deeper, slower, as though the air itself had thickened. A merchant from Porto dropped his fork with a muted clatter, blinking as though his vision had clouded. A scholar rubbed at his temples, muttering that he could not quite recall the reason for the gathering, though he held the invitation in his very pocket. Luis moved among them with the grace of a host in his element, refilling glasses, touching shoulders lightly as he passed, his smile unchanging, though his eyes seemed brighter now, almost fevered. When the clock in the hall struck midnight with a deep, resonant chime, he raised his own goblet, the wine within catching the candlelight in such a way that for an instant it seemed almost black, and he murmured, not loudly but with a clarity that seemed to reach every ear, "The feast has only begun." And at those words, the wind outside shifted, rattling the ivy against the windows like fingers scratching to be let in, while somewhere far beneath the floor there came the faint but undeniable sound of something moving, slow and deliberate, in the dark. It was in the winter of 1899, when the earth in the village graveyard still bore the frozen crust of December, that the whispers began to swell into something less like idle gossip and more like the restless breath of a thing no longer content to stay buried. For though the church had proclaimed the deaths of the 10 devout to be blessed and worthy of sainthood, they had refused the official rite of canonization on grounds known only to the Vatican archivists, who wrote in cramped Latin across a sealed page. Reversi sunt, they have returned, and in that cold season, when the fogs rolled in so thick from the moors that the lamps on the lane barely cast a halo, the people swore they saw figures walking the edge of the cemetery fence, not in the shuffling, erratic manner of drunks, nor with the purposeful stride of thieves, but with that slow, inevitable procession of pilgrims who already knew their destination. And it was in those days that Father Anselm, keeper of the parish for 30 years, began to write his nightly confessions not in the confessional, but in his own locked study, the candle burning low as he scrawled trembling words about hearing knocks at the rectory door long after midnight. 3 knocks each time, measured, patient, and though he had the courage to answer on the first and second nights, he found only the dark lane and the sound of retreating steps on gravel. Yet by the 3rd night, when he opened the door again, the fog parted enough to reveal a tall man in a robe that had once been white but was now stained with earth, and though his face was gaunt, the eyes were unmistakably those of Brother Matthias, the very man whose hand Father Anselm himself had kissed in farewell at the deathbed 17 years before, and who had been lowered into consecrated ground on a spring afternoon when the bells tolled with aching solemnity. Matthias spoke no Greek. The healer, who had once tended to the sick during the plague years, kneeling by the window of the apothecary, her hands cupped as though to gather herbs, though the shop had been closed for 2 decades, and her bones, if they still lay there, rested only a few feet from Brother Matthias's, and here the matter took a turn from the strange into the unholy, for Celestine was witnessed not by drunks or superstitious crones, but by the town physician, Dr. Henley, whose training in Edinburgh had left him with a skeptic's mind and a distaste for ghost stories, yet who returned from his evening rounds pale as milk, insisting that the nun had turned her head and met his eyes, lips moving as though in prayer, though he heard no words through the glass. Only saw the faint fog of her breath on the pane before she turned and walked into the alley, vanishing between the 2 brick walls as though she had never been. Word of these apparitions spread quickly, and by epiphany the town was in the grip of a fevered dread, for the number of sightings had risen to 5, half the number of the so-called saints, each return marked not by the violent theatrics of hauntings, but by the quiet, almost purposeful nature of visits, as though the dead were not wandering aimlessly but following a sequence, a plan, one that would be fulfilled in due course. It was then that Father Anselm, desperate for guidance, sent a sealed letter to the diocese describing what he had seen, but the reply he received was curt, bearing only the instruction to keep the church sealed after Compline and forbid the people from entering the graveyard after sundown, a command that only deepened his suspicion that the higher clergy knew more than they were willing to confess. And so he kept watch himself, braving the bitter winds at night to patrol the cemetery wall, lantern in hand, listening for the sound of those measured. Under the deep, unbroken darkness of an autumn morning in 1899, the hills of Villamura lay quiet, except for the restless stamping of hooves in the abandoned courtyard of the Duarte Estate, where the carriages of the 102 invited guests still stood as though frozen in place, their polished lacquer dulled by a week's worth of damp night air, their horses shifting uneasily, eyes wide as if sensing something their human masters could not. The estate's massive oak doors, ornately carved with the heraldic crest of the Duarte family, a grapevine twisting around a silver chalice, remained firmly shut, despite the faint, almost imperceptible sigh of music drifting from within. Slow and mournful strings that seemed too steady, too measured to belong to any mortal hand. In the village below, whispers had grown over the past days into a fevered dread. None of the guests had returned. Not a single coachman had been seen riding down the winding road, and even the post-riders avoided passing near the vineyard, claiming that the air around the property carried the scent of overripe fruit and something sweeter still, something metallic, cloying, that lingered in the nostrils long after one left. It took 3 full weeks before a search party, composed of men who swore they feared no spirit nor curse, worked up the courage to approach. They crossed the weeded gravel path, their boots crunching in rhythm, hearts pounding faster with each step toward the silent facade, where the curtains in every high arched window hung stiff and unmoving as though glued to the glass. With a heavy shove, the men forced the doors inward, expecting perhaps the sight of overturned tables, spilled wine, or the reek of decay. Yet they found the dining hall eerily pristine. The long table had been cleared of food entirely, the silver trays polished to a gleam, and only the wine goblets remained, still, half full. The liquid within unstirred, unspoiled, glinting like garnets beneath the muted candlelight that burned with impossibly steady flames. No dust lay upon the surfaces, no signs of a struggle marred the room. and yet the air felt thick, as though it resisted each breath. The music they had heard from outside was now faint, emanating from below their feet, beckoning them toward a narrow stairwell that descended into the stone belly of the house. Down in the cellar, among neat rows of barrels, each branded with the Duarte crest, the men swore they heard muffled singing, soft but layered, as if a choir were harmonizing from within the sealed casks themselves. One of the searchers, a young man named Luis Duarte, kin to the master of the estate, stepped forward with trembling hands and a determined jaw, prying at the iron hoops of one barrel until the wooden lid gave way with a groan. What spilled forth was not wine, but a rush of thick, warm air, heavy with the scent of crushed grapes and something alive. In the dim glow of their lanterns, something pale moved within, fluid, slow, almost serpentine. And in that instant the others saw Luis's face slacken into a rapturous expression before he was pulled forward, swallowed into the darkness of the barrel's interior with a sound that was neither splash nor scream, but something in between. The men fled without looking back. Yet they swore that as they stumbled up the stairs and out into the daylight, the cellar's singing grew louder, richer, and mingled with laughter that seemed to follow them through the vineyard rows. To this day, no one has seen Luis again, though some swear that on certain autumn nights the windows of the Duarte Estate glow with golden candlelight, shadows dancing in rhythm to that same slow music, and travelers who stray too close to the vineyard sometimes hear a voice, soft, coaxing, impossible, lie close, offering them a drink straight from the source. The Duarte crimson wine is still produced in limited, coveted bottles, its flavor unlike anything else in Portugal. Yet no one in the village dares to ask where the 102 guests truly went, nor why the barrels in the cellars must always remain sealed, each with its own faint heartbeat, if one is foolish enough to press an ear against the wood.